name is Emily, and I lead the environmental and climate change work at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, with a Quaker, nonpartisan lobby shop that's been around more than 75 years. And so a lot of the work that we do is working to seek common ground with all of our legislators to find that of God in each person. And so all of the issues that we work on at FCNL, we work to build up bipartisan support for and try to see each Congress where we can move our issues forward. So I think we've all been faced this question of, given the current administration and a divided Congress, there's been all this amazing momentum around climate policy and environmental issues in the media and through congressional hearings and presidential debates, but we're also still in this moment where realistically we're not going to see any comprehensive climate legislation signed into law this Congress. So the earliest that could happen is in 2021, potentially after a new election. But I want to flag that you need 60 votes in the Senate to pass something for it to become law. So FCNL believes that we still need bipartisan support for all of our issues, kind of regardless of the election outcome. But it's kind of this widely conceived notion here in DC that it's going to be really difficult to get anything major done right now. So a lot of the questions that we face are, what can we still do to advance climate change and justice work in this Congress? And B, how do we lay a foundation and educate members of Congress and build those relationships with our members and their staff so we can ensure that we're ready for as soon as we have a political opportunity to pass something? How do we take advantage of that? And a lot of that groundwork has to be done now, which is why it's so important that you all are here and that you'll be meeting with your congressional offices. So there are a few issues that I want to touch on briefly, and then I know Ruth has a couple of other things she wants to talk about, and then we can open it up to questions that you all might have. So the first is I want to point to a victory that we saw in the Senate. It hasn't fully gotten over the hurdle yet, but the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee passed unanimously in a bipartisan fashion out of committee the America Transportation and Infrastructure Act, which basically looks at all of America's surface transportation and infrastructure. And this bill, for the first time, had a climate change section of the bill. And this was a climate section that was passed with bipartisan unanimous support that did things like provide grants for charging stations for electric vehicle and alternative fuel vehicles, looked at reducing truck emissions at port facilities, looked at diesel emissions reduction, carbon capture, grants for relieving congestion. So these are all things that maybe we don't think of automatically as the thing that will solve climate change, but they're important pieces to the equation, and the fact that there's kind of some climate explicit language in this bill we saw as a victory. Now the next step is to actually pass this bill on the full Senate floor, and then of course the House would have to pass something equivalent. But for us it was a really hopeful sign. So if you happen to have a senator who sits on the Environment and Public Works Committee, you should ask them about this and see what they think is going to be next steps for timing of moving that forward, and thank them. Another kind of key thing that we've been looking at that widely is held as our best opportunity to actually see emissions reduced this Congress is something known as the tax extenders package or tax credits. So every year Congress just about goes through this really kind of frustrating process where they decide that there are problems with the tax code that need to be fixed, or there are tax credits on a whole variety of issues that are extended on an annual basis that need to be updated, extended again and yet again. And so this year, when the House Ways and Means Chairman Neal passed the House version of this kind of tax package, they left out all of the renewable energy tax credits that we thought were really important and needed to be updated. And this bill has a lot of other really good things around childhood nutrition and SNAP benefits and kind of poverty credits, but they left out things like a tax credit for energy efficiency, or for offshore wind, or electric vehicles, or the energy storage. These are all things that have broad bipartisan support in a lot of cases, but we're missing from the package. There was no mention of revamping the solar and the wind investment and production tax credits, which a lot of advocates are arguing for an extension on. So right now is kind of this crucial moment for us as advocates to figure out how do we build up enough political will for members who sit on either the House Ways and Means Committee before the Senate Finance Committee to make sure that those tax credits aren't left out of the final package, right? So kind of common sense, we should be promoting energy efficiency and energy storage. These tax credits currently on the books have either expired or need to be updated. So how do we ensure that this is a priority when the House and Senate have a conference and figure out kind of the final compromise on the final version of the bill? So that's kind of another core thing that we're watching. And the religious community last week sent out an interfaith sign-on letter that got 17 national religious groups to sign on to it, urging these committees to prioritize these renewable energy credits moving forward. So that's something that we've been focused on a lot. And then the third thing that I want to talk about is carbon pricing or a carbon tax. And I think, briefly to explain kind of the thought process behind why this is one important tool that Congress should be considering. I think my disclaimer is that FCNL believes that carbon pricing can be a really important tool, but can never be enough to fully address the problem or address a lot of the serious equity concerns that need to be thought about as we're addressing climate change. But the whole thought process behind carbon pricing is that you put a price for every metric ton of greenhouse gas pollution, and that price will increase annually. And what that will do is it'll serve as a market signal to help transition towards cleaner sources of energy. I think people often think about it as being important for our electricity sector, but there's also, it sends an important signal to other kind of harder to decarbonize sectors like transportation or agriculture or manufacturing. So it has like an economy-wide price. And then, so there's a lot of talk about, well, how high should the price be and how quickly should it escalate to actually be effective in reducing emissions? And then there's a whole other question around, what do you do with the revenue? And as the religious community, we've been asking a lot of kind of tough questions of existing bills or kind of hypothetical bills. How could you design this policy to make sure that a variety of communities are actually helped and not harmed? So think about it for a second. If you're making fossil fuels more expensive, you as a consumer are going to feel that price impact in some way, whether it's through increased gas prices or increased heating costs for your home, increased food prices, and that price will affect people differently, right? So if you live in a rural area and have to drive 45 minutes to the grocery store, that might affect you a little bit more, or in different ways than if you were living in an urban area. You could take public transportation to get to the store. And maybe you didn't spend a lot of money on gas to drive around, but you had high energy costs to heat your home in the winter. So we've been thinking a lot about how would you design a policy to ensure that low-income communities are helped and not harmed by this policy, thinking about the impact on communities of color, on communities that live in rural places, on communities that are indigenous, kind of some of the populations that we want to really make sure are seeing a benefit from this policy and not harmed. We know that a carbon price alone cannot address a lot of historic injustices that need to be addressed as part of climate policy, but we see it as one tool that will help make some of the other legislation that's needed a little bit easier to implement. And so there's lots of things you could do with all of this revenue that you would generate from the carbon tax. You could, kind of the most maybe widely known piece of legislation would return the revenue back as a monthly dividend to each household. There are other pieces of legislation that would think about changing how our tax system works, so they would maybe reduce the payroll tax and then use additional revenue for low-income assistance or weatherization. There are bills that currently put revenue towards infrastructure or job training. So the handout that I passed around, it looks at the 6 existing bills that are currently in Congress. We expect to see 1 or 2 more at least in the coming months. And what's exciting to me about this is that now that we have so many different ideas out there on the table, it's a really great way to go into your congressional office and say, what do you think of this bill? If you don't like it, what about this other idea? We have so many ideas to toss around. Then in my day-to-day work, maybe I have a member of Congress who doesn't like the money going back as a dividend, but they're really interested in infrastructure or job creation. And so it's just a really good conversation starter. And for us, it's a good tool to try to educate members of Congress about this policy and about how we want it to be designed to, again, to try to advance our equity concerns as much as possible. Another kind of big controversy just to note is that some of these bills, though not all of them, try to adjust regulation or regulatory rollback or get rid of it. None of the bills kind of blanket get rid of all regulation. Most would put a pause implementing a regulation like the Clean Power Plan, which is currently, as you know, was rolled back by the Trump administration and is tied up in the courts. And so the argument for that decision from those on the right has been, we don't want emissions regulated, kind of taxed twice. It's regulated and taxed. I'll just say that the bills that are bipartisan have some sort of regulatory adjustment, and the bills that are Democrat only don't. They don't touch regulation at all. None of the bills that change regulatory authority fully get rid of the Clean Air Act. None of them limit states' abilities to regulate these pollutants. None of these bills change how these pollutants can be regulated for their public health benefits. And most of them, though not all, say if the bill isn't working, like if emissions aren't being reduced, then the regulations go back into effect, and the EPA actually has more legal authority to try to reduce emissions through their EPA authority. FCNL has not endorsed any of these 6 bills. We have, I think, a lot of questions about all of them, but I think it's a really good conversation starter. So we think it's important for you all to know that the conversation around carbon pricing is building momentum, and we see it as kind of, right now, it's the only kind of major climate solution that has bipartisan support. So we're using this as a really important opportunity, again, to lift up the equity concerns that we have and get members thinking about how to make this as strong as possible, and how to think of it as only one of many tools that Congress is going to ultimately need to use.